Hi everyone. I forgot to press record on Zoom. So here I am in my living room, just after Bible. So you're getting the full effect because I'm wearing the same clothes. I'm looking quite smart tonight, I think, actually. And Jonathan is on his way back from Louisville. So I've got a bit of time now. So I thought I'd just do a little rerun of what we've just done as we've been looking at chapter 14, verses 1 to 25 of Mark's Gospel. And we're in our last section of the Gospel. It's chapters 14 through to 16, and you'll notice in the starting verse Mark gives us a time marker that really signifies that we are in a different part. It's a move on from, if you remember, chapter 15 was the apocalyptic kind of talking about the destruction of the temple and ultimately judgment that happens when Jesus comes back for the second time. And in that, as he moves in, he says it was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And this is a really key thing, the time of what is going on. So it's 2 days before the Passover, and the events of this chapter all happen around that time. And actually the events of the rest of Mark's Gospel all happen over the course of the next few days. So in a way, it's like Mark is kind of slowing down the narrative. We've had essentially Jesus' whole ministry packed into 13 verses. That's pretty much 3 years packed into 13 verses, and then we hit chapter 14 and he slows down. Mark's narrative slows down because really what we're moving towards is Jesus' death on the cross. It's imminent, it's happening soon, and that's where the whole gospel has been moving towards, because Mark's purpose in writing is to show us that Jesus is God's king, and ultimately God's king came to die for his people. And so we've been turning our faces towards Jerusalem since back in chapter 8, and here we get the climax. We're about to see betrayal, an unfair trial, Jesus hung on that cross, buried in a tomb. Ultimately we get chapter 16 and the resurrection, which we know, but Mark slows down so that we can weigh up, really respond to what we're reading. And it's poignant, it's weighty, it's huge what he's saying. And actually in our section tonight we have a bit of a sandwich. Mark loves a sandwich, doesn't he? We've got a betrayal sandwich. If you notice, we've got the chief priests in verses 1 and 2 who are really rubbing their hands with glee that they're really seeking to kill by stealth Jesus. And then we have Judas in verses 10 and 11. So we have him who is ultimately going to be the betrayer, and in the middle of it we have this woman, one of those people in Mark's Gospel who, she's unexpected, she's not who we would expect to be the commended person, but this woman, we don't even know her name, who breaks a flask of perfume over Jesus and shows costly devotion. And so in the middle of betrayal we have costly devotion to Jesus. And actually in our passage we have 2 meals. We have the first meal where the woman is, and the second meal, which is the Passover celebration that Jesus is having with his disciples. And as we read it and hear him speaking to his disciples, we realise that Jesus himself is front and centre in this Passover meal. And as we're going through this passage, we'll realise that second meal speaks into the first meal and helps us understand this really extravagant, costly devotion that the woman shows us. And I was thinking about devotion this week, and devotion, we see it in lots of different ways, don't we? We're devoted to various things, whether it be our family, our kids, our pets, our careers, our hobbies, maybe our phones, I don't know, whatever it may be. There's been a few examples. A big example this last week, I think, where the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's husband, he died. I'm sure you didn't miss it. There was a wall-to-wall media coverage of it. 73 years they were married. 73 years that Prince Philip has devoted his life to, not only to his wife, but to the duty of serving the country. It's incredible the way he took a back seat, really, walking those 2 steps behind her for much of their married life in service of the country. I mean, that is devotion to a large degree. I came across another level of devotion this week. There's a Facebook group. It's got 91,000 members. It's called the Chicago Vaccine Hunters. It's an amazing thing, really. The purpose of this group is to get as many people as possible, as many people who want to be vaccinated, vaccines. So people in this group, all you do is you message on the group and say, I'd love to find a vaccine for my 80-year-old mother, or for me now that I'm eligible. And someone in the group, a few people, will say, I can help. And they've been getting appointments for people all over the Chicagoland area. It's amazing the level of devotion. Actually, now they've got to the point where vaccines are more available. It's easier to make it happen. And some of them are just a bit at a loose end, really. There was someone on the group yesterday saying, what are we going to do with ourselves now that I haven't found anyone appointment all day? What am I going to do? Like, they're so devoted to the cause. I mean, imagine if the devotion was to Jesus and the gospel. So I think I'm sure when you think of the word devotion, then there's a whole host of things that you think of, and that's just a couple of examples. But here in this passage, I think there are three standout themes. We have this betrayal, devotion, and Jesus' death. Obviously, they're all intertwined, and Jesus' death is wrapped up in the Passover, which is emphatically mentioned 5 times in just these verses. There's no doubt as to the timing of the events. Mark makes it really clear. And so the Exodus rescue narrative plays out in the background of all that's going on. Do you remember in Exodus we have that moment, that momentous time when God says to his people, paint the doorframe of your house with the blood of a lamb, a sacrificial lamb. And as death passes through the land that night, you, under the blood of the lamb, will be rescued, will be saved, will be safe. And that is what is being celebrated annually. The Jewish tradition is to celebrate the Passover. For centuries, for generation after generation, the Jewish people, God's people, have been celebrating the Passover. And it's this time of year that this is happening. And Jesus is making it really clear that rescue, that ancient, the thing that's been remembered, passed on from generation to generation, that's the background that's playing out in all that's going on here. We're thinking sacrifice, rescue, covenant promises kept, and the offer of life freely held out to those who are willing to take it. We've had Exodus previously in Mark, haven't we? He's referred to it back in the feeding of the 5,000. We've had this idea of rescue before, and the Passover timing just brings it really clearly into focus. It's a big moment in Mark's narrative. Jesus' death is fast approaching as we hear of Judas' betrayal. You can see the chief priests rubbing their hands as they plot his destruction. But then the action pauses as we watch a woman without a name break a flask of expensive perfume and pour it over Jesus. She's no one special, but her actions and her heart are standout. This is the person who's got it right. This is the person we are to watch, to understand, and to copy. We've seen that before in Mark's Gospel, haven't we? We've had people along the way who have just shown us what it is to respond to Jesus rightly. And this is one of those people. But why? What is it about her? And at first glance, as we read it, we might well agree with the objectors who are outraged at the apparent waste of resources. This is a 300 denarii bottle of perfume, and that could have been used to help others. But Jesus defends her. Did you notice it in verses 6 and 7? She has done a beautiful thing for me. We'll come back to his defence, but first, I think in order to get there and to understand it, we need to go to the second meal in the passage. That's the meal that we see in verses 22 to 25. Without grasping what Jesus is saying there, it's hard to understand why the woman's actions are beautiful and worthy. And getting to the meal, actually the verses that get us to the point where Jesus is breaking bread with his disciples, the disciples organise it just as Jesus says, and it all happens according to his word. The man with the jar of water, the room that's ready for them, the fact that Jesus is clearly, powerfully in charge. Things are happening as he intends, and that includes the remaining events of Mark's narrative. It's not just now, this meal, but actually everything that is about to unfold is according to God's will. Jesus, God's King, has it exactly how it is supposed to be. And so we have the meal, it's happening, this Passover celebration. The shock of betrayal is heard. You notice that in those verses? They're all like, what? No, surely not us. And they're reeling, the disciples are reeling, although verse 21 assures us that everything is happening to the Son of Man as it is written of him. Because we might think at this point, well, the betrayers, it's all in the hands of the betrayers. The chief priests have persuaded Judas and now they've got the upper hand and Jesus is going to go to his death unjustly. But actually, there is nothing outside of God's intention here. This is how it is supposed to be. And then we get to this just momentous few lines, really. We have the breaking of the bread and the drinking of the wine. And these things explain why and for what purpose Jesus is to die. I don't think it's any accident that bread features again. We've had it, if you go back to chapter 6, 7 and 8, the big picture of God's rescue. Do you remember that rescue that's even bigger than the Exodus rescue that's pictured in the feeding of the 5,000? And then we have the bread under the table. You remember the Syrophoenician woman? The disciples not quite getting it because they're not quite grasping that Jesus is the one who's bringing God's rescue. God's rescue is front and centre in this explanation of Jesus' death. That rescue is on offer. And Jesus is holding it out as he says, take. And through it, the new covenant is fulfilled. Did you see that big kind of Bible word in the middle there? That is the promise that God made, that God will always be God to his people. His people will always be his. He will always be their God. But the problem is that sin has been getting in the way of that. There's a problem if we have a holy God and we're a sinful people. The covenant seemingly cannot be fulfilled, yet the blood of Christ. That means that this covenant can happen. The new covenant is fulfilled. God is able to be in relationship with his people because of Jesus' death. The sacrifice is for many, it's for others, it's not for him. The disciples are benefiting from it. It needs to be received though. Now ultimately, Jesus' death takes the place of the Passover lamb. He is the sacrificial lamb that means that life is possible. It's mind-blowing. And then we consider that it's not just the disciples who benefit from his death, but us as well. It's not just those sitting around the table, but us as we read of it now, as we grasp what is happening as Jesus dies on the cross. We sit here receiving Jesus' death and gaining life through it. Wow. We were saying in our group that if we were Jewish, if we'd been going through these celebrations, these traditions for generation after generation, we probably have a greater wow factor to what's going on here. This whole thing is drenched in the promises that God has made way back in Exodus, Genesis times. It's drenched in the symbolism of the sacrificial lamb at Passover. And so as we begin to grasp just a little of that, and I think the more we think about it, the more we let our hearts kind of let it sink into our hearts, the more we see, wow, this really is a wow. And as we get the wow, so we might be able to understand more of the woman's costly devotion. And in fact, Jesus' defense of her. The woman has broken the flask of perfume over him. It's not like she's just taken out the stopper and poured a bit out. The whole thing is broken. There's no way of keeping some of the perfume back. It's all for him. She's all about Jesus. And he sees that as he says that she has done a beautiful thing for me. It's a right devotion because she is pouring out everything for God's King. And then he goes on to say, a couple of verses later, she has done what she could. She's given all that she has for Jesus. He's not asking for anything more than what she could do. And it's not that we're thinking, what has she done to then earn the love of God, the favour of Christ? That's not it. This is in response to Jesus. And he's not asking her for anything more than what she can do, what she has. And he recognises that she's given him her all. She's given out of her all. her resources, a treasured bottle of perfume is being poured out for Jesus. And we've seen this before, haven't we? Back in the temple, we saw a widow, a poor widow. Rich people pouring their coins and surplus coins into the offering box. And she gives all that she has and is commended. And so we know this is the heart that Jesus commends. This is a beautiful thing. I wonder if we can say that of our Christian lives. Not what are we doing to earn the love of God. Not what are we doing to make sure that we have this life that Jesus is offering. He freely offers it without charge. We have that. This is past tense. Jesus' death has secured us God's rescue life with him. But in response to that, as people who are of Christ, who are loved by him, are we doing everything for Jesus? Are we all about God's King? Is that evident in our actions, our words, our use of resources? Are we doing what we can? Are we using all we have for Jesus? Is God getting our best, even when that means sacrificial living? Our hearts that are wowed and struck and really absorbing the reality of what Jesus has done, is the overflow of our hearts devotion, costly devotion to Jesus. And this costly devotion, giving all that we can for Jesus, is deemed beautiful. And it will be remembered forever. That's what happens to her, isn't it? Every time someone reads Mark's Gospel, they see her and they see a beautiful thing. The woman is flanked by betrayal, and the rest of the chapter circles back round to betrayal as we see Peter and the other disciples abandon Jesus. It's something I've been thinking about this week, but what if costly, persistent devotion to Jesus is the means of keeping going? What if being like the woman is the way of not being like Judas? It sounds kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? Surely they're just so worlds apart, but maybe this wholeheartedness is not hedging your bets, not straddling two different camps as such. Maybe that's the thing. Wholehearted devotion to Jesus, the thing which stops us kind of beginning to turn our back on him or to just give up on walking with him. I wonder if we can stop the slide into betrayal if we love Jesus with all we've got and give to him all that we can. So what does it look like? Well, it's different for everyone according to our resources, our gifts, our circumstances. We're all different, aren't we? God has made us different, put us in different places. But the heart is the same, a love for Jesus that's evident in the way we are living our lives. Jesus takes top spot at the cost of other things. Our finances, maybe, our time, maybe our career or where we choose to live. Would your family know that you're devoted to Jesus? Would your friends, your colleagues? Jesus says it's a beautiful thing. And that doesn't mean that others will always think it's a beautiful thing. We might well get grief from others for being devoted to Jesus. But even if others don't think so, Jesus says this costly devotion to him is a beautiful thing. So as we come out of this passage, I think we see that costly devotion to Jesus is right and good and beautiful. It's worth it because Jesus and his death gives us life with God forever. So as a group of women, as a group who are gathered around the word in fellowship, in unity, loving one another, let's spur one another on to costly devotion like this woman. Let's encourage one another, sharpen each other, talk about these things. Even if you're watching this video on your own and you're not talking, you're not in a group, we're not discussing, why not actually just drop someone a text who's in Bible study or have a conversation when you're at church on Sunday? Talk about these things so that we would be a group of women who really are doing the beautiful thing.